Along a tranquil stretch of coastline where rolling farmland meets the pounding surf, an ordinary morning was about to spark an extraordinary conflict. When a crew of modern pirates thought they could strong-arm a solitary farmer off his generations-old property, they assumed they'd face little more than a polite local. What they didn't realize was that this quiet farmer was Jake Riker, one of the deadliest Delta Force commandos to ever serve. This showdown would begin with hushed intimidation and escalate into a high-stakes battle that threatened not only the peaceful fields he cherished, but an entire coastal community that never saw the storm coming. As the seabirds circled overhead and the wind whispered through miles of farmland, Jake Riker stood at the ready, unaware that his life of hard-earned peace was about to collide with the ghosts of his past in a fight that would change everything. Quick pause before we continue. Welcome to Fabled Frames. Please tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow's story is mind-blowing. Part 1. A large seagull circled the sky, its raucous cry drowned out by the crashing surf along the rugged coastline. Underneath the blazing midday sun, the coastline looked nothing short of idyllic, wind-swept fields, a farmhouse perched near the edge of rolling hills, and a scattering of livestock grazing without apparent worry. To any observer, it might seem a sleepy, old-world setting, far removed from the hustle of the modern age. There was nothing to hint at the fact that this particular stretch of farmland was owned by a man who had once been the deadliest operative in Delta Force, the United States Army's elite counterterrorism and special missions unit. And there was certainly nothing to suggest that, just beyond the horizon, a crew of modern pirates was sailing toward it with nefarious intentions. Jake Riker, retired Master Sergeant, Delta Force legend, stood shirtless at the edge of his expansive farmland. He was in his mid-40s but kept himself in prime condition. Lean muscle, sharp eyes, and a presence that conveyed a silent warning to anyone foolish enough to test him. He was fitting a new barbed wire fence post into the ground, sweat trickling down his brow. Instead of the coordinated gear he once wore during covert missions overseas, he now sported dusty jeans, a sweat-stained t-shirt tossed over a nearby fence, and boots caked with mud. He moved with a quiet efficiency that only years of high-stakes operations could instill in a person. Every motion was purposeful. Every sense was on alert. Even while focusing on the fence, Jake's mind ran through a million quiet computations. The wind direction, the briny scent of the sea, the distant hum of a motor that did not belong to any local fisherman. His farm dog, a grayish-blue border collie named Bandit, raised its ears. The dog, too, sensed something out of place in the air. Jake had made his home here after his final operation went awry years ago. The chance to escape the madness of urban chaos and the echoes of global conflict was irresistible. He chose farmland for its discipline. Rising early, tending the animals, running a small produce business at the local farmers market. The routine was a far cry from night raids and infiltration behind enemy lines. The tranquil setting offered him something he had rarely known in his decades of service: peace. But that peace was never as complete as he liked to pretend. While he offered smiles and fresh vegetables at the market, few people knew that the most lethal skill set in special operations lingered beneath his genial exterior. Fewer still realized that the local, simple farmer had taken part in hostage rescue missions in Africa, covert infiltration in the Middle East, and search and destroy ops in parts of the world that never made the headlines. The only real proof of that life was hidden deep in a locked basement beneath the main barn. A veritable arsenal of advanced weapons, specialized comms gear, and contraband from conflicts that would make international arms dealers salivate. He'd prayed, in his own way, that he'd never have to use any of that again. This afternoon, though, the ocean's wind carried a threat that Jake's instincts recognized before he consciously formed the thought. There was a foreign presence out there. The engine thrumming across the waves was not the normal sputter of the local lobster boats, nor did it match the robust roar of commercial fishing trawlers. It sounded heavier, more ominous, and accompanied by a distinct metallic clank that echoed unnaturally over the rolling surf. Setting aside the barbed wire, Jake wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and lifted a pair of battered binoculars from a pouch strapped to the fence. Through the dusty lenses, he surveyed the watery horizon. The glimpses of movement made it clear. A large vessel was edging toward a hidden cove on the eastern side of his property. He couldn't see any official markings, no Coast Guard, no national insignias. It also was not a typical cargo freighter. If anything, it looked like a repurposed industrial ship, metal plating welded in improvised fashion, sporting crates on its deck that looked suspiciously like sealed shipping containers. "And that's not a pleasure cruise," Jake muttered under his breath. Bandit whimpered, half excited, half cautious, as if the dog sensed the tension that now radiated off its master. Jake lowered the binoculars and focused on the water's edge again. He spotted movement. Small figures hustling about on deck, preparing what looked like dinghies or small speedboats. He was no stranger to black market operations. In the dim corners of his memory, he could recall times in the Middle East or South America when smugglers used similar vessels to run guns or narcotics into remote shorelines. It was never good news for the people living nearby. As a soldier, Jake had learned to trust his gut above all else. He knew a storm was coming. His only question was, how big would this storm be? He decided it was time to gather more intelligence, quietly and discreetly. He had no desire for a firefight or any confrontation, but if trouble was coming, he needed to be prepared. He knelt down next to Bandit and ruffled the dog's fur. "Let's go for a walk, boy," he said, retrieving his shirt from the fence post. In his mind, he was already planning. Checking vantage points, considering what vantage spots overlooked the cove, mapping out possible escape routes, mentally recalling all the gear in the hidden basement. Peace was a luxury. Preparedness was mandatory. With that, he headed toward the main house, an old farmhouse passed down through generations but lovingly restored. Tall windows overlooked the ocean on one side, and a wide porch offered a panoramic view of the farmland on the other. There was a barn, more modern in construction, set a ways back from the house. Off to the side stood a smaller tool shed with an attached greenhouse where Jake grew specialized produce. The entire property exuded a sense of serene isolation. Entering the house's mudroom, he toweled off quickly and slipped into a fresh but worn chambray shirt. Then he moved into the living room, which was sparely decorated with practical furniture. The only hints of his past were a single photo in a frame near the mantel, showing a younger Jake in his army uniform with a small group of Delta operators, each wearing proud but weary grins. He glanced at the photo with a tightness in his chest. Memories threatened to resurface, but he blinked them away and focused on the matter at hand. If those men had taught him anything, it was how to operate with calm efficiency under duress. Jake's eyes then flicked to a door that appeared to be a simple coat closet. He stepped toward it and paused, listening for any sound outside. Silence. Satisfied he was alone, he opened it to reveal not coats, but a hidden keypad on the inside wall. He tapped in a 6-digit code, and there was a faint whir. The entire back panel of the closet clicked, swinging inwards to reveal a narrow staircase leading down. Just inside the panel, on a small wooden shelf, lay an M17 pistol, a relic from his service but kept meticulously clean and functional. He grabbed it and tucked it into a concealed holster at his waist. He descended into the basement, each footstep echoing softly. The space opened up into a large, rectangular room illuminated by motion sensor lights. Along the walls were racks of equipment, some standard hunting rifles, some older but reliable firearms he'd collected over the years, and a few more exotic pieces. Suppressed carbines, advanced optics, ballistic vests. He wasn't here to gear up for war. Not yet. But he wanted a closer look at what was out on his shoreline without the risk of being caught off guard. He took a battered, dark green rucksack from one of the shelves and filled it with binoculars that had better magnification than the ones outside, a handheld radio with an earpiece, and a small drone, a personal purchase from a former comrade who had since gone into private security contracting. That drone had a camera sharp enough to pick out the brand name on a baseball cap from hundreds of yards away, and it folded up to the size of a hardcover book. Next to the drone, he placed a compact first aid kit. Old habits died hard. Though his instincts advised him to bring more, he exercised caution. If it turned out this was merely some bizarre fishing operation or a bunch of reckless tourists, he didn't want to charge in fully armed and spook them. With the rucksack slung over his shoulder, he jogged back up the stairs, sealed the secret door, and moved swiftly toward the part of the property that overlooked the cove. The path meandered through tall grasses and wildflowers, with the occasional oak tree offering patches of shade. It took Jake nearly 20 minutes to reach the rocky outcropping that formed a natural overlook. There, he could gaze down at the water. He crouched low behind a cluster of sea oats, set his rucksack down, and deployed the drone. "Time to find out who's trespassing," he whispered, flicking on the control pad. The drone buzzed to life, its rotors spinning in near silence. He eased it up over the edge of the cliff, tilting the camera downward. The cove was secluded, surrounded by jagged rock walls that made it invisible from most directions. On the small beach below, he saw men unloading crates from an inflatable boat. The large vessel he'd seen earlier was anchored just offshore, rocking gently in the swell. Through the drone's high-resolution feed, he counted at least a dozen men milling about. Several wore mismatched tactical gear. Some had civilian clothes, cargo pants, t-shirts, but were armed with rifles slung over their shoulders. They seemed jumpy, scanning the surroundings as if expecting resistance. One man barked orders in an accent Jake couldn't immediately place. Another individual, seemingly in charge, wore a distinctive black bandana and carried a sidearm with an oddly etched grip. Jake's gut tightened. These weren't typical smugglers or petty thieves. Their gear was too diverse, their manner too organized for a ragtag group of amateurs. He zoomed in further and noticed, with a jolt of recognition, that a couple of them had patches or tattoos that hinted at affiliations with maritime militias or pirate networks that roamed the coasts in more lawless parts of the world. He'd run into some of these networks during deployments in Africa and Southeast Asia. They often disguised themselves as fishermen until they boarded unsuspecting vessels to loot them or hold them for ransom. Now, it seemed they'd broadened their horizon. They were bristling with weapons and evidently had some plan for coming ashore. He guided the drone closer, making sure to keep its engine hum masked by the coastal wind. He saw crates labeled with cryptic markings, possibly contraband or stolen goods. Another crate, opened, revealed a glint of metal, rifle barrels, or possibly contraband that could be resold on the black market. One of the pirates kicked the crate shut and yelled something. Another man pried open a large box with a crowbar. A flood of black, brick-like shapes spilled out. Explosives, Jake realized with a surge of adrenaline. The shape, size, and packaging told him these were not the typical plastic charges used by hobby miners or demolition crews. This was professional-grade stuff, enough to blow a city block if used properly. Jake's mind spun with speculation. Were they planning to stash these explosives here temporarily? Or perhaps they were using this remote farm as a staging ground for something bigger. One thing was certain. The presence of that much ordnance did not bode well for anyone in the vicinity. And that included him. He swallowed, controlling the surge of adrenaline that began to hammer at his composure. His heart rate was elevated, but his training held firm, enabling him to observe calmly and methodically. The men seemed anxious to get everything ashore quickly, perhaps before the rising tide complicated their offloading. The entire operation was efficient but tense. One of them pointed inland, and another raised a pair of binoculars to scan the shoreline. Jake immediately dropped the drone a few feet, letting the bluff's natural curvature shield it. The last thing he wanted was for them to spot the drone. His vantage was still good enough to keep watch, though. He angled the camera, scanning each face in turn, searching for any sign of the group's leadership. He spotted the man with the black bandana again, barking orders. Another individual, tall and wiry, with a scar running diagonally across his face, nodded along. This scarred man seemed just as commanding, or at least a trusted lieutenant. Jake's practiced eyes noticed the professional way the scarred man handled his rifle. Finger off the trigger, muzzle pointed low, scanning with an economy of motion that implied extensive combat experience. They began speaking in hushed tones, gathering around a makeshift table. The drone's audio pickup was too far to catch their conversation. Jake wondered if they had a route planned inland, to find a safe house or possibly a buyer for their goods. The farmland around here, including his own, was vast and mostly isolated. With careful movement, they could hide a small army or stash contraband for quite some time. That thought sent a chill down his spine. Quietly, Jake guided the drone back to his position and caught it in one deft motion as it descended. He powered it down and placed it back into the rucksack, taking care not to let any reflections off the lens alert the pirates below. Then he crawled a few feet away from the cliff and stood, pressing himself against a large boulder to remain hidden. His mind raced. Should he call the authorities? The local sheriff was a well-meaning man, but with limited resources and no experience against a dozen armed and well-equipped maritime raiders, there was little he could do. The Coast Guard might intervene at sea, but these intruders were already on land. Beyond that, the official channels might move too slowly, giving the pirates time to slip away or, worse, carry out whatever operation they had in mind. Memory after memory came flooding back, situations where waiting for backup cost innocent lives, where decisive action saved them. Jake knew that if these were indeed modern pirates armed with explosives, a small-scale local law enforcement approach could lead to tragedy. He needed to be the one to intercept them, or at least figure out their next move before they had a chance to spread out into the community. The next local farm was miles away, but eventually, these men would stumble upon it, or pass through the small coastal towns that dotted the region. Lives were at stake. He saw a flicker of movement down below again. They were forming two groups. One group started hauling crates onto a second inflatable boat, smaller than the first. Another group fanned out along the shoreline, apparently scouting. They were talking on handheld radios now. Jake could see them keying in transmissions. They must have come prepared for all contingencies. His heart thumped as he realized their next step. A recon of the area that might bring them to the outskirts of his land, which was dangerously close if they kept moving inland. He clenched his jaw, adrenaline firing through his veins. He needed more information. At the very least, he needed to ensure none of his neighbors were around, potentially stumbling across these intruders. Fortunately, it was the off-season for tourists, and his nearest neighbors were older folks who rarely ventured this far, particularly along the rocky coastline. Still, it only took one unfortunate fisherman or hiker to walk into these men's path. Jake took a moment to consider his next move. This was not a simple observe and report situation. This was about safeguarding innocent lives. A confrontation, if it happened, would need to be swift and decisive. The stolen explosives loomed in his mind. If these people planted them anywhere near a populated area, the devastation would be unimaginable. And if they found out about him, discovered who he really was, they might consider him the biggest threat and strike his property preemptively. A swirl of wind kicked up salt spray, momentarily stinging his eyes. Bandit, who had remained quietly by Jake's side, let out a low growl. The dog sensed Jake's tension, as well as the presence of unknown intruders. Jake glanced down at the loyal border collie. "Looks like we're not done with danger after all," he said quietly, scratching the dog's head. "Sorry, boy." His mind snapped into the kind of hyperfocus that had once been his lifeblood. Step 1. Confirm the exact location and capabilities of the intruders. Step 2. Ensure the safety of local innocents. Step 3. Disrupt or neutralize the threat. It sounded straightforward, but he knew from experience that operations rarely went by the book. He decided he'd head closer to the cove on foot, picking a route through the dense scrub and uneven ground so he could listen, watch, and maybe gather clues to their immediate intentions. Then, if necessary, slip back to his farm and gear up for the worst-case scenario. At that moment, though, something caught his attention. A faint mechanical thrum. He froze and listened. Sounded like a small drone. Immediately, he crouched, scanning the sky. Indeed, a tiny speck hovered above the cove. A new sense of dread shot through him. These pirates had drone surveillance too. Perhaps they were checking the route inland, or just ensuring no unwelcome spectators were around. Quickly, Jake eased back, putting a cluster of boulders between himself and the cove. The last thing he needed was to be caught in the open. He pressed himself flat against the rock, Bandit quietly at his side. He heard the drone pass overhead, that telltale humming slicing through the coastal air. A minute later, it swung back toward the beach, presumably returning to its controller. Jake let out a silent breath. So they had at least one drone, a well-armed group, multiple crates of weaponry and explosives, and the advantage of surprise. They believed, clearly, that no serious threat awaited them on this quiet coast. They didn't know Jake Riker lived there. They had no idea who he really was or what he was capable of. He took a moment to steel himself because he knew once the first shot was fired, there would be no turning back. He'd be reverting to a role he had hoped was forever in the past. As he moved inland, half-crouched, he heard muffled voices from below. The black bandana leader was shouting an order. Two men jogged inland, likely a scouting party. They were heading in the direction of the farmland. The farmland that happened to be Jake's home turf. He ducked behind a stunted pine tree and watched, his teeth clenched. The pirates were well armed, but they didn't know the terrain. That gave him a slim advantage. If those scouts got too close, he would have to engage. But to act prematurely could tip the entire group off to his presence. There was a delicate balance here, and Jake was determined not to break it, unless he had no other choice. Yet it was becoming clear that confrontation was inevitable. The presence of explosives, the scale of the operation, and the potential for the pirates to spread out across the region made it only a matter of time. If Jake didn't act, they'd claim the advantage. If he called in the authorities now, he risked a botched official response that could lead to innocent casualties. Gazing around, he realized that the path these scouts were taking would lead them directly to one of his farm trails. Another hour or so, and they might stumble upon the outer barns. If they found no one there, they might keep pushing in until they discovered the house. He swallowed hard, acknowledging he had less time than he would have liked. Strategy formed in his head. Misdirection, neutralization, systematic sabotage. All those years in Delta Force had taught him how to handle a numerically superior foe. This time, though, the battlefield was his backyard. He carefully backed away, choosing a different route to skirt around the scouts, determined to reach the farm first. Bandit followed, tail low, senses razor-sharp. With each step, he reminded himself, this was his land, his home. He might have never chosen to be a farmer if his past had gone differently, but it was the life he cherished now, and he would defend it fiercely, decisively. Within moments, he had disappeared into the wind-rippled grass, invisible to any drone or scout looking for movement. Silent as a ghost, Jake Riker made his way home, fully aware that the peace he had fought so hard to build was on the brink of being shattered. By the time the sun set, there would be no more illusions of tranquility. His property would become a battleground, and the pirates would learn a lethal lesson about underestimating the simple farmer who, in reality, was one of the deadliest commandos to ever walk the earth. Jake now knows armed pirates with advanced gear have come ashore, and a scouting party is heading directly toward his farm. Their explosives suggest a major operation. Will Jake reach his farmhouse in time to secure his arsenal and prepare a countermeasure, or will the pirates catch him off guard on his own land? Part 2. Jake moved swiftly yet carefully over the rolling terrain, guided more by memory than by sight. He stuck to the dips and folds in the land, using the tall grasses and wild shrubs as natural cover. Every so often, he paused to listen for signs of the pirate scouts. The sea breeze carried the faint tang of salt and the distant squawk of gulls, but he heard no human voices. At least not yet. Bandit trotted alongside him, nose constantly twitching. The dog's ears pricked at the slightest sound, twigs snapping, branches rustling. More than once, Bandit froze, hackles raised, before Jake heard anything out of the ordinary. The two of them communicated through subtle glances and shifts in posture, like a pair of seasoned partners who had long ago perfected the art of silent teamwork. Despite the intensity of the situation, Jake experienced a peculiar calm. It was like slipping into a well-worn role, one that he had honed through countless missions overseas, in places and under conditions far harsher than this. His farmland was a gentle landscape of rolling hills, scattered forests, and ocean overlooks. The enemy might be unknown territory, but the setting was his home. He was used to feeling tension coil in his muscles the closer he got to a target area, but here the tension felt more personal. This wasn't just another hotspot on a map. It was his refuge. If these pirates forced him into a confrontation, he would show them no quarter. He picked his way around a small thicket of brush, pausing at the crest of a shallow hill. Ahead, he could see the edge of his farmland. Fences stretched across the property line like lazy ribbons. Past them lay the open fields where he grew vegetables and kept a small dairy herd. No sign of his goats or the 3 cows. They had presumably wandered off to graze behind the barn. In the distance stood the farmhouse, a sturdy structure of wood and stone. The barn loomed behind it. To anyone else, it might look like a picturesque postcard image. Jake pulled out his binoculars for a quick scan of the perimeter. The sun's glare forced him to adjust his angle. He spotted no immediate signs of movement near the house or barn, which was good. If the pirate scouts had gotten this far, they were doing a remarkable job of staying hidden. He glanced at Bandit. The dog's nose lifted, sniffing the wind. After a moment, Bandit let out a soft huff, tail wagging once in agitation. Jake interpreted that as the dog detecting something in the distance, but no immediate threat in close proximity. With a nod of silent gratitude, he began to move again, angling toward a copse of trees that offered a concealed path back to the farmhouse. As he crept forward, he thought about how he needed to handle this. Ideally, he wanted to avoid a direct confrontation until he had a solid plan. The pirates were at least a dozen strong down by the cove, likely more. Jake had made an internal guess of around 15 to 20 men, including the ones staying on the anchored vessel. However, the scouting party was smaller. 2 men? 3? Possibly 4. Even so, that was enough to cause serious trouble if they stumbled on the house unprepared. His immediate objective was to secure his property, keep the scouts from discovering the secrets in his barn or worse, capture him in his own home. A big part of that was ensuring that if trouble broke out, he had the advantage. In Delta Force, that advantage boiled down to training, intel, and surprise. Right now, the pirates had no idea who they were up against or what resources he had at hand, and Jake intended to keep it that way. At the edge of the tree line, he crouched behind a massive oak. From there, he had a clear view of his front porch and the dirt road that wound toward the main gate. As he scanned the property, his eyes fell on his pickup truck, parked off to the side of the house. For a split second, he considered driving to the local authorities. But doing so might as well send a beacon to the pirates, especially if they had scouts watching the area. They'd see him drive off, possibly giving them free rein to raid his home. Plus, he had zero guarantee that the local sheriff's small department could handle a pirate incursion. No, better to lay low for now, gather more intelligence, and wait for an opportune moment to tip the scales in his favor. He took one more careful look around. Then, satisfied the immediate area was clear, he set out in a low jog toward the barn. Bandit trailed him, silent and alert. The distance was only a couple hundred yards, But in Jake's mind, it felt like crossing a battlefield, every nerve on edge. When they reached the barn, he slipped inside and gently closed the large sliding door behind him. The familiar scent of hay, feed, and farm animals greeted him, a far cry from the swirling dust and diesel smells of conflict zones. He let out a small breath, grateful for the temporary cover. Sunlight filtered through the barn's high windows in dusty beams. Jake moved between stacks of hay bales and feed sacks, making his way toward the back wall. He opened a small side door into a secondary storage area. At first glance, it appeared to be a cluttered space for old tools, but he pushed a wide shelf aside, revealing another hidden keypad. After glancing over his shoulder to ensure absolute privacy, he tapped in the code. The reinforced door behind the shelf clicked open, revealing the well-lit, secret basement corridor leading below. He and his father, long deceased, had installed the hidden space decades ago, originally for storm shelter and emergency supplies. Over the years, Jake expanded it, adding layers of security that rivaled what he'd seen in covert military facilities. Bandit hesitated at the top of the stairs, ears perked, before descending behind his master. Jake turned on the overhead light, revealing a broad room brimming with crates, shelves, and weapons racks. This was his arsenal, the place he kept the tools of a life he'd hoped never to revisit. Now, it seemed that every skill, every piece of gear he had painstakingly maintained, was about to become relevant again. He wasted no time. Moving to a far wall, he opened a long crate and extracted a lightweight ballistic vest. Next came an old friend, his suppressed M4 carbine, outfitted with a red dot sight and a foregrip. He ran his fingers along the receiver, a mixture of grim nostalgia and steeled resolve flaring in his chest. After checking the weapon's functionality, he never stored anything here without ensuring it was ready for action. He grabbed several loaded magazines from a sealed ammo case and secured them in a chest rig. He also retrieved a pair of night vision goggles. Sunset wouldn't arrive for hours, but it paid to be prepared. When he was done, he set the carbine down momentarily and pulled out one more piece of crucial equipment, a scanning device that could monitor common radio frequencies. He had used it in the past to listen in on smuggler or militia communications overseas. It was old tech by special operations standards, but it would likely suffice. With care, he toggled it on, adjusted the frequency range, and waited. A flurry of static assaulted his ears at first. Then, faint voices began to filter through. He recognized a harsh accent, possibly West African, though he couldn't be certain. Another voice spoke in heavily accented English. They mentioned moving inland, scouting the perimeter, and the next cove. Intermittent bursts of static made it difficult to pick out everything. He caught a snippet. "Maybe nobody's here. We find a quiet spot, set up the stash, and wait for," then more static, then a clearer phrase, "Make sure no one sees us. Keep an eye out for any vehicles." Jake grimaced. They planned on stashing explosives and staying hidden, possibly to meet a buyer or coordinate some larger operation. Or maybe they aimed to set up an extortion scheme along this part of the coast. Whatever the plan, it spelled danger. He turned off the device, carefully stowing it in a pouch on his belt. Then he slung his M4 across his chest and nodded at Bandit. "Time to see if we can steer them away from the farm," he murmured. He wanted to handle the scouts quietly if possible. Taking them on directly risked alerting the larger group. But if they found the farm on their own, there was no telling how fast the rest of the pirates would converge. As Jake turned to leave the hidden basement, a faint beep sounded from the corner. His motion sensor alarm, the one connected to a small set of cameras he'd installed around the property for added security, was registering movement near the backfields. He crossed the room and checked a simple black and white feed on a secured monitor. Sure enough, two figures were moving along a fence line, both armed with rifles. Their posture suggested they were searching, scanning for any sign of life. They wore tactical cargo pants and t-shirts that clung to them from the humidity. One man had a buzz cut and a thick beard, the other was lean with a shaved head. Both looked fit and lethal, a far cry from random looters. Jake stifled a curse. They were closer than he'd hoped. He shut off the monitor, replaced the shelf to conceal the door behind him, and climbed back up into the barn. Now the real cat-and-mouse game began. Jake stood in the barn's loft, peering through a small gap in the wooden boards that overlooked the back fields. He had taken position with the suppressed M4 resting on a bale of hay, providing a stable shooting platform if things went sideways. Through the gap, he spotted the two scouts as they moved methodically along the fence. They paused at the corner post, pointing out features of the land. One of them took out binoculars. Jake felt his muscles tense. The men were scanning the barn and the house now. If they saw anything suspicious, they might radio their leader. That would bring more pirates, or prompt them to investigate further. Either scenario could escalate into a firefight on his property, possibly endangering anyone else who might be in the area, though Jake believed his few neighbors were far enough away. For now, while the pirates spoke in hushed tones, Jake considered his options. 1. He could remain hidden, let them do their recon, and hope they moved on. 2. He could incapacitate them quietly, preventing them from reporting back. But taking them out risked gunfire that would echo across the fields, alerting the main group. A suppressed weapon wasn't entirely silent. The mechanical action of the rifle, plus any sonic crack from the bullet, could still be heard, especially in open farmland. Yet letting them continue unchecked might allow them to spot footprints, tools, or anything else suggesting someone was active on the farm. They might decide to set up a vantage point in his barn or farmhouse if they thought it abandoned. Jake felt the clock ticking in his mind. A wrong move now could compromise everything. Below him, Bandit remained in the shadows, well-trained enough to remain calm. The dog lay poised near a stack of pallets, ears pricked, ready to spring to action if Jake commanded. For a moment, Jake recalled an operation overseas, in a remote desert town. His team had been pinned down, and he'd had to systematically pick off enemy scouts to prevent them from alerting reinforcements. He hated the memory, the violence, the necessity of lethal force, but he'd done his duty. Now, that same duty loomed large. He watched as the bearded scout hopped over the fence, heading closer to the barn while the other remained on the far side, scanning with binoculars. They must have agreed to split up and see if the barn was occupied. Jake's stomach twisted. If the bearded man came inside, the chance of a quiet resolution was slim to none. The bearded scout advanced, hunched slightly, rifle at the ready. He seemed confident but cautious. His gaze flicked around the barn's exterior. The closed main doors, the small side door, the loft window. Each step was measured. Jake cursed under his breath, wishing he had had more time to set a trap or create a distraction. Instead, he was pressed with an immediate decision. He inched the muzzle of his rifle through the gap in the boards, aligning the sights on the scout's torso. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. If he took the shot, could he do so without alerting the second man? The farmland was eerily quiet. No roaring machinery or bustling roads to mask the sound. And if the second scout heard gunfire or even the faint pop of a suppressed shot, he'd immediately radio the others. The main group would storm the farm in minutes. Even if Jake could handle that, it would blow the element of surprise wide open. The bearded scout suddenly paused just a dozen yards from the barn, scanning the upper windows with narrowed eyes. Jake froze, finger sliding from the trigger guard to the trigger itself. The man lifted his rifle, adjusting the scope. Jake felt an adrenaline surge. He could sense the scout's suspicion. Behind the barn, a loud metallic clang echoed. Jake nearly jumped, but he held firm. The sound came from the other side, likely a loose gate that swung in the breeze. The bearded man spun toward the noise, momentarily exposing his flank. Jake inhaled a steadying breath. This was an opening if he decided to act. Should he strike while the man was distracted? He weighed the risk. If he killed or disabled the scout here, the second one, stationed a little farther out, would likely see the body or at least notice his partner missing. That might buy time if Jake knew how to conceal the evidence. But the farmland was wide open. No easy place to hide a body without the other scout noticing. And there was still the question of whether the scout could radio mid-ambush. A single code word and the entire pirate crew would be inbound. Jake made his decision in a flash. Keep it quiet. Avoid lethal force unless absolutely necessary. There had to be another way. Carefully, he withdrew his rifle from the gap, slinging it over his shoulder. Then he pulled out his sidearm, his suppressed M17, and made his way down the loft ladder as silently as possible. He moved toward the side door, heart hammering, muscles coiled. The scout was right outside. If Jake could open the door quietly enough and catch him by surprise, a stealth takedown was possible. He had a chance to do this without gunfire. He was a master of close-quarters combat. One man was manageable. It was the second scout that concerned him. He pressed an ear to the wooden planks. Outside, he heard the man's muffled footsteps, his breathing, the click of a rifle safety being tested. Jake exhaled slowly, then eased the door open a fraction of an inch. The barn was old, and the door hinges threatened to creak. He paused, letting the wind push gently, reducing friction. The door opened enough for him to slip through. Bandit remained inside. Jake gave him a hand signal to stay. Stepping out into the sunlight, Jake kept low, hugging the barn's exterior. Just around the corner stood the bearded scout, facing away as he peered around the far side of the barn. The scout's attention was on the open gate that had clanged a moment ago. Time slowed. Jake's training kicked into automatic. In one fluid motion, Jake lunged forward. He clamped one hand over the scout's mouth, driving the muzzle of his suppressed pistol into the man's ribcage. Simultaneously, he swept the scout's legs, using a pivot of his hips to bring the man down. The scout crumpled under the sudden onslaught, eyes bulging in shock. He tried to grunt, but Jake's gloved hand muffled any sound. In quick succession, Jake delivered two brutal jabs to the side of the scout's neck, momentarily stunning him. The man's rifle clattered to the ground, but Jake caught it before it made much noise. The scout struggled fiercely, grappling for purchase. Jake pinned the man's arm behind his back with an iron grip. Within seconds, he had the intruder face down in the dirt, jammed up against the barn wall, pistol pressed to his temple. The scout's eyes flashed with terror and anger, a hardened fighter, but unprepared for the speed and precision of a Delta-trained assault. Jake kept his voice low. One sound, one move, and you're done. Understand? The scout's nostrils flared as he nodded, face half buried in the dust. Sweat beaded at his temple. Jake slowly eased his hand away from the scout's mouth, but pressed his weight on the man's back to keep him immobilized. Over the man's shoulder, Jake saw the other scout in the distance, still scanning the horizon. If that second pirate turned around, he might spot them at any moment. They were partially concealed by the barn's corner, but not perfectly. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears. Quietly, he eased the man's radio from his belt. "Is your comm open?" he hissed. The scout gave a half shake of his head, indicating no. Jake prayed he was telling the truth. One accidental press of the transmit button could blow the entire operation. Jake patted the man down, found a sheathed combat knife and a small pistol. He tossed them aside. The scout glared upward, but fear lurked beneath that anger. Jake leaned close enough for the intruder to hear his whisper. "Who are you working with? What are you doing here?" The scout's lips trembled with uncertainty, then defiance. He pressed them tight, refusing to speak. Jake applied a bit more pressure, forcing the man's face into the dirt. "You don't want to die here," Jake growled, voice barely above a breath. "Tell me," or I'll make sure you never leave." Still, the scout remained silent. Jake glanced at the second pirate, still about 80 yards away, but turning to look in their direction. Jake had no time for an extended interrogation. He glanced back, meeting the pinned man's eyes. "Last chance." The pirate's chest heaved. He coughed, spitting out dust. "We are only scouting," he whispered, accent thick. "Bringing cargo inland. That is all." Jake ground the pistol barrel against his skull. "Explosives." The man's eyes flickered with something, recognition, or surprise that Jake already knew. "Yes, we stashed them. Wait for buyer." Jake narrowed his gaze. "Where's your base of operations? How many more of you?" The pinned scout clenched his jaw. "Enough." A wry sneer twisted his lips. "If you kill me, the others will find you." His stare held a measure of calculated confidence, but Jake saw sweat dripping from the man's temple. "We have many men. You cannot fight us alone." Jake felt a cold wave wash over him. The man was clearly betting that intimidation might save him. If the pinned scout could stall or distract, the second pirate might notice something was amiss. Indeed, the second scout started walking in their general direction. Jake could see him searching with those binoculars. Time to make a decision. Silently, Jake rolled the man over, driving a swift elbow strike into the side of his head. The scout's eyes rolled back as he slumped into unconsciousness. Jake quietly dragged the limp body behind a stack of wooden pallets leaning against the barn, keeping the scout's gear out of sight. The entire takedown and concealment had taken less than a minute. Jake peeked around the corner. The second pirate was closing in, cautious steps betraying suspicion. He must have noticed his partner had disappeared. Jake's pulse hammered. If the second scout discovered the incapacitated man, it was game over for stealth. Yet if Jake tried to approach him in open ground, there was a strong chance of being spotted before he got close enough. Meanwhile, the pirate likely had a radio on him, ready to call in reinforcements at the first hint of trouble. Jake weighed his options. The only cover between the barn and the second scout was a dilapidated livestock pen and a rusting tractor. That might be enough concealment if he moved fast and quiet. He checked the unconscious man. No sign of waking soon. With a tight breath, Jake pressed himself against the barn's side, scanning the terrain. The second scout paused and raised binoculars again, scanning left to right. Jake crouched, heart pounding. He moved in a swift crouch behind the rusting tractor, wincing at the faint crunch of gravel under his boots. The wind gusted, whistling around the tractor's skeleton. Through a gap in the chassis, he caught a glimpse of the scout's legs, about 30 yards away. The man started to walk again, heading in a slight diagonal, directly toward the barn corner where the first scout had vanished. Jake realized he had maybe seconds before the pirate discovered his unconscious partner. If that happened, an alarm would be raised, and the entire mission of stealth was done. He unclipped a small tactical knife from his vest. Using lethal force was the last thing he wanted, but he might have no choice if the pirate raised an alarm. With the suppressed pistol in his other hand, he let out a slow exhale, then pivoted around the tractor. At that exact moment, the scout froze mid-step. His eyes snapped to something on the ground. Footprints, a trail of disturbance. Jake cursed silently. The man crouched, touching the footprints. He lifted his head, scanning the area with intense focus. This was it. The next move would decide whether Jake could maintain control or lose it entirely. Quiet as a whisper, Jake sprinted from behind the tractor. The scout stood, startled, swinging his rifle around. Their eyes met. Both sets widened in simultaneous shock. The pirate fumbled for his radio. In one fluid motion, Jake flung the knife, aiming low to avoid a fatal strike. The blade sank into the man's thigh, forcing a strangled cry from his lips. He stumbled, rifle dropping from his grip in a reflex of pain. But the pirate still reached for the radio, face twisted in agony yet determined to warn his crew. Jake charged, slamming the man's arm away. The radio fell to the dirt and crackled with a burst of static. Jake stomped on it. A single squeal of feedback erupted, and then silence. The pirate snarled, lunging with unexpected strength. He swung a wild punch that clipped Jake's shoulder. The impact stung, but Jake turned his momentum, driving a knee into the man's midsection. The pirate doubled over, gasping. Jake ripped his knife from the man's thigh, causing another choking cry. Then he pressed the tip of the blade against the pirate's throat, hissing, "Not a sound." For a heartbeat, they locked eyes. Pain and fury churned in the pirate's expression, but fear was there too. Blood trickled down his pant leg. Jake forced him backward, keeping the blade at his neck. The man's teeth ground together in an attempt not to scream. Jake's voice was low and urgent. "Any last word you want me to pass on to your friends?" It was a risk, letting his anger out. But these men had brought explosives and planned to terrorize an innocent coastal community. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The pirate's eyes darted to the smashed radio. He spat out a curse, sounding desperate. You can't stop us all," he rasped. "Our captain. He will burn this place if you—" Jake's arm lashed out in a lightning strike, the knife handle connecting with the side of the man's head in a precise blow. The pirate's body went limp, collapsing into Jake's arms. Quickly, Jake dragged him toward the same concealed spot behind the pallets. He bound the pirate's hands with flex cuffs he carried in his vest, did the same with the bearded scout, and checked their pulses, both alive, just unconscious. He took their sidearms and tossed them out of immediate reach. Jake found himself breathing hard. 2 pirates subdued, but the rest still out there, including the main group near the cove. Sooner or later, they'd realize these men were missing. And if the pirates discovered them tied up on Jake's property, all hell would break loose. He stared at the horizon, mind racing with scenarios. He had taken a dangerous step, but one that might buy him time. Now he had 2 prisoners and a farm that was no longer a secret to the enemy. The question was, how to leverage this advantage before it vanished. Because inevitably, the rest of the pirates would come looking. And from what these scouts hinted, they had a captain who commanded enough firepower to turn Jake's entire life into rubble if he wasn't careful. A cold certainty settled in Jake's gut. The path ahead was clear. He would have to go on the offensive, strike hard and fast before the pirates could marshal their forces. For the sake of his farm, his neighbors, and the coastline he'd come to call home, he'd do whatever it took. Jake has neutralized 2 pirate scouts, but the rest of the crew is still at large, and armed with a dangerous stockpile of explosives. He must decide quickly how to use his advantage before the pirates realize their men are missing. Will he manage a stealthy preemptive strike? Or will the pirates discover his actions and launch a full-scale assault on his coastal farm? Part 3. Jake crouched behind the barn, the midday sun pressing down on him, breathing heavily as he gathered his thoughts. He had 2 pirates bound and unconscious, hidden away in the shadows. They would remain that way for at least a short while, but the rest of the crew, likely still offloading contraband and explosives in the cove, would eventually come looking. The clock was ticking. He patted down the second pirate's gear, finding little of real value beyond a half-charged phone, some spare ammunition, and a folded sheet of paper with hastily scrawled coordinates, likely referencing a rendezvous point inland. He slipped the coordinates into his vest pocket. He could study them later if the situation allowed. The phone might offer a clue as well, though it was password protected. He didn't have time to break it open right now. Bandit poked his head around a bale of hay, ears perked. Jake met the dog's gaze and offered a reassuring nod. If they were going to keep the upper hand, Jake needed to take another calculated risk. Waiting around for the pirates to come searching would give them the momentum. Striking first might tip them off, but at least it would be on Jake's terms, possibly sowing confusion among their ranks. He glanced at the unconscious intruders again. Using them as hostages could be an option, but that might just provoke a more extreme response from their captain. Another approach was to leave them here, locked down, while he moved against the main group at the cove. But the cove was a decent hike away, and if he left his farm undefended, more scouting parties might slip in behind him. It was a juggling act, defense versus offense, all on a sprawling battlefield that was supposed to be his quiet home. He considered the location of the cove. The pirates had anchored their vessel there and begun ferrying weapons, contraband, and explosives ashore. They might be planning to move the cargo inland by truck. Given the coordinates he'd found, there was probably a meet-up location further up the coast road or perhaps near an old logging route that cut through the hills. If they managed to get those explosives out of the cove, they'd be far harder to track. Something Jake couldn't allow. He swallowed a surge of adrenaline, forcing himself to focus. A direct assault on the cove was suicide if the pirates were still heavily armed, especially if they had men stationed on the ship with vantage over the beach. Jake's best bet was sabotage. He could use his drone or his knowledge of the terrain to plant a diversion, draw them out, split their forces, then pick them apart. The memory of countless Delta Force operations flickered through his mind, presenting 100 creative tactics. But he had to choose the one that best fit these circumstances. Time to get eyes on the situation at the cove again. He motioned to Bandit. "Stay," he whispered. He didn't want to risk the dog in a direct infiltration, and Bandit's presence might complicate stealth. "Guard." Bandit's tail wagged once in acknowledgement. The dog padded over to the unconscious pirates and sat watch, ears pricked. Jake cracked a small smile at his loyal companion. Then, gripping his suppressed M4, he slipped away from the barn and headed for a tree line that offered some cover en route to the cliffs. It took him roughly half an hour, moving cautiously, to circle back to the overlooking bluff. The sun had shifted, throwing new shadows across the rocky outcroppings. Below, the pirates still labored on the beach. Jake eased down on his belly, crawling behind a cluster of scraggly coastal shrubs. He used the high-powered binoculars again, scanning the scene. It looked like they had unloaded several large crates from the anchored vessel. Some men were hauling them up a narrow path that led inland. Others stood watch on the rocky beach, rifles in hand. The improvised dinghies or inflatables bobbed near the shore, tethered to stakes hammered into the sand. The big boat, anchored a short distance out, remained a hive of activity. Through the binoculars, Jake counted at least 4 more pirates on deck, presumably waiting to offload additional cargo. He inched the binoculars across each face, looking for the men in black bandanas. One had clearly been giving orders earlier. Now he spotted that same figure again, the pirate captain. The man stood near a half-unloaded crate, shoulders tense. He was barking commands at a smaller subordinate who kept checking some sort of handheld device, maybe a GPS or a satellite phone. 2 other pirates hovered protectively nearby, rifles always within arm's reach. Jake's attention shifted to the top of the crate they were opening. He zoomed in on the stenciled markings. Foreign characters half scratched off, with a partial code that might have indicated military-grade ordnance at some point. The captain reached in, pulled out a sleek black cylinder, some type of shaped charge. Jake felt a tremor of alarm. This was serious hardware, enough to blow through reinforced walls or create large-scale destruction if used in an urban setting. He swallowed, fury sparking inside him. This was precisely the kind of cargo that Jake had once dedicated his life to intercepting, halfway around the globe. Now it was in his backyard. The captain slammed the crate lid shut, gesturing to a pair of men who hefted it with grunts. They began carrying it inland along the same path the other crates had taken. Jake followed them through his binoculars, seeing where they went. The path sloped upward, disappearing into thick brush that eventually flattened into a field. If the pirates had stashed vehicles somewhere up there, that field would be the most likely place. He eased away, careful not to skyline himself on the bluff. The wind rustled his hair, bringing the pungent smell of seaweed and brine. He needed to figure out how to neutralize or disrupt this operation before it reached critical mass. If they finished unloading, the pirates could spread out, fortify positions, and maybe even vanish into the countryside until their buyer arrived. Jake's mind worked through permutations, from sabotage to infiltration. He had an array of resources at his farm, explosives of his own if he decided to use them. But if he set off a large-scale blast to destroy the pirates' cargo at the beach, the resulting explosion might cause collateral damage or pollute the waters. A smaller targeted strike could be more surgical, like taking out their boats or their vehicles. If the pirates had no means to transport or move their cargo, they'd be stuck, forced to stay close to the cove until they found an alternative. That, in turn, could buy Jake time to call for reinforcements more discreetly. Not that local law enforcement would be thrilled about an unknown ex-special ops soldier waging a covert war on farmland. But in the face of armed marauders, Jake figured they'd be more relieved than anything else. He considered a classic approach: knock out their mobility. That meant disabling the large boat or the inflatables. If he sank their main vessel from a distance, the pirates on the beach would be stranded. But that could also provoke them to scatter inland, rampaging in desperation. Alternatively, if he set a trap for their vehicles, assuming they had trucks or something hidden up the path, he could box them in between the sea and farmland. Then again, these men seemed ruthless. Cornering them might push them to use the explosives in a last-ditch effort. Jake's pulse quickened. He needed a precise plan, not a hasty reaction. Carefully, he unzipped his rucksack and pulled out the compact drone. He double-checked the battery, then launched it from behind the rocky outcrop, letting it hover at low altitude to avoid detection. He guided it inland, staying well above the pirates' line of sight, scanning the terrain for vehicles or hidden stash points. The live feed on his handheld controller flickered to life, revealing an overgrown trail that led to a small clearing behind a thick copse of pines. And there they were, two nondescript trucks and a beat-up jeep. A man in fatigues stood smoking a cigarette, clearly on guard. The crates had started to arrive. A forklift of some sort was parked nearby, presumably used for loading cargo onto the trucks. It looked like they were prepping to move out soon. Jake's heart pounded. If those trucks left the clearing with a payload of military-grade explosives, the threat would expand beyond his farmland, potentially endangering entire towns. Their final destination was anyone's guess. A port for international smuggling? A terrorist buyer looking to strike a city? The possibilities made Jake's stomach churn. He recalled the GPS coordinates he'd lifted from the scout's pocket. That could be a rendezvous point further inland, or perhaps a location where they planned to stash these weapons. Either way, the trucks were the linchpin. If they were incapacitated, the pirates' plan might unravel. But to do that, he'd have to get close enough to sabotage them. Jake guided the drone a bit lower, checking the area for sentries. He counted 3 men near the vehicles, all armed. He also noted a small tent or makeshift canopy where crates of supplies were stacked, possibly food, water, or additional gear. If he could approach that spot unobserved, maybe plant a timed explosive on the truck's engines or tires, he could cripple their mobility. However, if the pirates caught him mid-act, he'd be in the middle of their territory with no easy escape route. He let out a tight breath, recalling the lesson hammered into him during special operations training: assess, adjust, act. He'd done his assessment. Now it was time to adjust his plan and act decisively. He recalled a smaller footpath that wound around the coastline, skirting the cove and eventually merging with a hunting trail that cut through the forest. If he took that route, he could circle around to the clearing where the trucks were parked. The brush and dense pines might provide enough cover for him to get close. Once there, he could rig some of his own explosives or simply sabotage the truck's fuel lines. If he was lucky, he could do it without firing a shot. He folded the drone and tucked it away, heart hammering with a mixture of caution and determination. This was not an official mission. There would be no cavalry if things went sideways, no backup or medevac. He was on his own, yet part of him thrived on that reality. It was the environment he had excelled in for years. Now, it was a test of whether those skills still held up. Before leaving, he took one final look at the beach. The pirates continued their methodical offload. They hadn't yet realized their scouts were missing, or if they had, it wasn't causing panic yet. Jake suspected they'd start to wonder soon. Time was short. Creeping through coastal underbrush, Jake kept his weapon at the ready. The path was narrow, barely distinguishable under ferns and low-hanging branches. The air was thick with the scent of pine and sea salt. Birds fluttered overhead, oblivious to the drama unfolding below. He moved at a steady pace, following a mental map of the terrain he'd gleaned from the drone feed. Within 20 minutes, the path veered inland, climbing a slight incline. The forest thickened, muffling the wind. His footsteps were as silent as he could manage, though he remained alert for fallen branches or dead leaves that might snap and give him away. At last, he reached a vantage point overlooking the clearing. Hidden behind a cluster of pines, he peered through his rifle's scope. The trucks and jeep were still there, along with the forklift. He spotted the three men standing watch, occasionally speaking to one another. Now, a fourth man had arrived, one of the pirates from the beach, probably delivering the latest crate. It looked like they were nearly done loading that crate onto the back of one of the trucks. Jake's heart drummed. The clearing was about 50 yards wide, ringed by tall pines. The men had a couple of tarps spread out, presumably for organizing supplies or protecting them from the dirt. Stacks of crates lay in partial disarray, as if the pirates hadn't fully sorted their cargo yet. If Jake could slip around the perimeter to the trucks, he might be able to plant a few improvised charges or even physically damage the engines. He reached a hand into one of his vest pouches, pulling out two small cylinder-shaped devices, magnetic charges. They were not big bombs, but each contained enough explosive to disable a vehicle's engine or break its axle if placed correctly. From a distance, they would appear to be unassuming lumps of metal. The blasts would be loud, but not massive enough to cause widespread destruction. It was precisely the kind of tool he needed for sabotage. Quietly, he replaced them in his pouch, then began a slow crawl through the pines, circling the clearing. He used the natural dips in the land for cover, occasionally pausing when one of the guards glanced his way. The air felt impossibly still. A single misstep could mean a firefight he'd rather avoid. A bead of sweat dripped down his brow as he reached the edge of the clearing, crouching behind a fallen trunk. The nearest truck was about 20 feet away, partially obscured by the forklift. Two pirates stood not far from it, talking in low tones. The heavy diesel smell of the vehicles hung in the humid air, mixing with the pungent scent of pine needles. Jake could see the truck's left front tire. If he could slip forward and attach a charge behind the wheel well, it might cripple the entire machine. He checked the other pirates. One was seated on a crate near the jeep, fiddling with a rifle. Another paced along the perimeter, scanning the forest. The fourth man was nowhere in sight, maybe inside the tent. This was going to be dicey. Jake waited, heart throbbing, until the pacing man turned away. Then he rose into a low crouch, carefully easing around the trunk. He slipped behind the forklift, using its bulk as cover. A lingering whiff of oil and grease invaded his nostrils. His breath came in shallow bursts as he slid next to the truck side panel. He was close enough to hear the muffled conversation of the two men behind it. They were speaking in a foreign tongue, too low for him to catch more than an occasional word in English. He mentally counted to 3. Then, moving with deliberate slowness, he reached under the truck, pressing one magnetic charge to the underside of the engine block. The magnets held firm. He flicked a small switch that armed the charge. A blinking LED lit up once, then dimmed, leaving the device operational but dormant until triggered by its remote or a timed countdown. Jake swallowed, silently thanking the years of training that allowed him to keep his hands steady in moments like this. Step 1 complete. He eased backward, flattening himself against the forklift to break line of sight with the men around the truck. Next, he needed to disable the second truck, but that was parked closer to the tent, with a pair of pirates rummaging through crates right next to it. The chance of slipping in undetected was smaller. As if on cue, the men near the second truck abruptly hoisted a crate. They carried it around the tent's far side, presumably to check its contents or shift it to another vehicle. Jake spotted his opportunity. The second truck was momentarily unguarded. Quiet as a phantom, he slipped along the forklift's opposite flank and hurried in a low crouch to the next vehicle, hugging the side panel. One of the pirates re-emerged, rummaging inside a wooden crate a few paces away. Jake pressed himself against the truck's door, hidden by the corner. The pirate's back was turned, but if he pivoted even slightly, he'd spot Jake instantly. Every muscle in Jake's body tensed as he slid his arm underneath the truck's frame. He affixed the second magnetic charge to the transmission housing. A faint click told him it was secure. He flicked the arming switch. The LED blinked once, then went dark. Done. A sharp rustle of movement startled him. One of the pirates was stepping around the rear bumper of the truck, footsteps crunching on gravel. Jake froze, pressing his body flat against the driver's door. He clenched his jaw, praying the man wouldn't come forward. The crunching footsteps paused. The pirate sighed, muttered something unintelligible, then moved away. Jake silently released the breath he'd been holding. He risked a quick glance around the corner. The pacing guard was returning, scanning the tree line. The men who'd carried the crate were now heading back with empty hands. If Jake stayed where he was too long, he'd be spotted. No choice but to leave quickly. Keeping low, he hurried back the way he came, ducking behind the forklift. Then he slithered behind the fallen trunk along the clearing's edge. Just as he slipped back into the pines, he heard a faint shout in the distance. The guard posted on the perimeter was calling out to someone. Jake didn't linger to see why. He crept deeper into the forest, heart pounding at the near miss. Once he was a safe distance away, he allowed himself a few seconds to breathe. Phase 1 of the sabotage was complete. With a single trigger, he could disable both trucks. But he still had to deal with the Jeep, and more importantly, he had to ensure the pirates didn't just call for reinforcements or discover him before he could finish. If they realized someone was picking them off from behind, they might flood the area with patrols. Jake checked his watch. The day was wearing on. He needed to be mindful that the pirates might start looking for the 2 missing scouts at his farm any moment now. And if those scouts didn't report in, the captain would know something was amiss. Jake had to strike fast and hard. The sabotage had put him in the game, but he was still just one man against many. His next move loomed in his mind. Was it time to pull the metaphorical trigger on the trucks, sowing confusion and delaying their exfil? Or should he take a risk and sabotage the Jeep first, further crippling their mobility before they realized they were under attack? Either way, he was out on a limb. The success of his plan, and possibly the safety of the entire coastal region, hung in the balance. Jake has secretly planted charges on 2 of the pirates' trucks, potentially crippling their operation. But the area remains heavily guarded, and the pirates may discover something is wrong at any moment, either at the clearing or back at Jake's farm. Will Jake escape undetected and finish the sabotage, or will a single misstep trigger a violent confrontation before he can strike? Part 4. Jake crouched among the dense pines, carefully checking his surroundings for any sign that the pirates had noticed his sabotage. So far, all seemed normal in the clearing behind him. The forklift rumbled as crates were shifted from one spot to another, and the men on guard paced or smoked, oblivious to the lethal little devices now attached to their trucks. He wiped a sheen of sweat from his forehead. The coastal humidity made breathing heavy, but he'd grown used to it over the years. Despite the tension, a part of him felt strangely alive. This was the adrenaline-charged environment he had once lived in daily. But the stakes weren't the same as in his old Delta Force days. He wasn't fighting in some distant war zone. He was fighting for his home. He quietly withdrew deeper into the woods, each step placed with the practiced care of an expert in stealth movement. Even the smallest twig snap could draw attention. The thick carpet of pine needles helped mask his footsteps. As he crept away, he allowed himself to consider his next move. His sabotage charges were set. At any moment, he could detonate them, rendering the trucks useless. Without those trucks, the pirates would have a far harder time transporting their explosives inland. But if he triggered the charges now, he'd lose the element of surprise regarding his own presence. The pirates would know they were under attack. They might scatter, or they might surge toward the farm in retaliation. He needed to coordinate the timing so it would deliver a maximum tactical advantage. He found a slight depression in the ground, behind a cluster of ferns, and sank to one knee. He retrieved his handheld radio frequency scanner, quickly flipping through channels. A short burst of static, then the staccato chatter of voices with thick accents. He strained to make out their words. Not responding scouts might be lost. Another voice cut in. Check with the captain, he said. A burst of static drowned the rest. Jake tensed. They had already noticed the missing scouts. Time was running out. If the pirates decided to send another search party or, worse, stage a direct assault on the farm, he needed to be ready. He also remembered those two unconscious pirates bound near his barn. He had left Bandit to guard them, but if a large group arrived, the dog wouldn't be able to hold them off for long. He flicked off the scanner, tucking it away. His plans started to form piece by piece. He envisioned drawing the pirates away from the cove, forcing them into more exposed terrain so he could pick them off from vantage points. The best way to do that might be to force them to come after him once they realized their vehicles were destroyed or threatened. But first, the jeep. He needed to ensure there was no easy fallback for the pirates. No quick vehicle in which they could speed away or chase him. He'd seen that small, battered jeep parked near the tent, next to the trucks. Planting a charge would be tougher now that the pirates were on high alert. Still, if he left it functional, they might adapt quickly to the loss of their trucks. Jake inhaled, the familiar calm of mission mindset settling over him. He had to move fast. Rising into a crouch, he retraced his steps around the clearing, planning to approach from the opposite side. He reasoned that the forklift's engine noise, plus the general bustle of men hauling crates, might mask his movements. The real challenge was avoiding the guards. As he reached the clearing's far perimeter, he peered through the branches. The jeep sat near the makeshift tent, close to a tall pine that offered partial cover. He counted the pirates. One near the jeep, leaning on it while talking to another. One pacing along the perimeter, scanning the woods. A fourth man rummaging through crates under the tent canopy. Jake swallowed. The risk was high, but the alternative was letting them keep a quick getaway option. He steadied his breathing. Then, an idea struck. Cause a small distraction on the opposite side of the clearing, lure the men away from the jeep, and buy himself seconds to sabotage it. A quick search of his vest pockets yielded a flashbang grenade. It was non-lethal but would create enough noise and bright light to send men scrambling. He weighed the consequences. If he used the flashbang, the pirates would know instantly they were under attack. Still, it might be the best chance to incapacitate them or at least shift their focus long enough for him to plant another charge on the jeep. Jake carefully inched around to a position where he had a decent throwing angle. Through a gap in the foliage, he could see the forklift driver, plus two men hoisting a crate onto the truck. The jeep was maybe 20 yards to the left. The men near it were partially distracted, engaged in conversation. He clenched the flashbang, pulling the pin with slow deliberation. Taking a final breath, he lobbed it in a high arc toward a spot near the forklift, away from the jeep. Immediately, he dropped to the ground, covering his ears. The flashbang detonated with a thunderous pop, a blinding flare lighting up the clearing. Shouts erupted. One man screamed, stumbling backward. Another dropped the crate with a crash. The forklift driver spun wildly, trying to figure out what happened. Jake burst from cover, sprinting toward the Jeep. The guard who had been leaning against it was now half-turned, eyes watering from the sudden blast. His companion was cursing, clutching at his ears. Jake slid next to the Jeep's passenger door and ducked down, pressing his body low against the metal. He wasted no time, reaching beneath the chassis with a magnetic charge. His movements were fluid with adrenaline. The device clamped onto the Jeep's undercarriage. He flicked the arming switch and felt the familiar small vibration indicating it was live. Perfect. A shout rang out behind him. One of the pirates had spotted him. Jake looked up and saw the muzzle of a rifle turning his way. The flashbang had sown confusion, but it hadn't blinded everyone. Without hesitation, Jake snapped up his suppressed M4, squeezed the trigger twice. The pirate crumpled, letting out a gurgled cry before collapsing onto the grass. Jake's heart thundered. He hated killing, but these men were well-armed criminals with no qualms about using deadly force. He scanned quickly, seeing another pirate staggering to his feet, blinking tears from his eyes. The forklift driver was stumbling away, disoriented. Two more men near the truck were aiming in random directions, not yet spotting Jake's location. He took a second to duck behind the Jeep, flipping a small handheld trigger out of his vest pocket. If he pressed the button, the truck's charges would detonate, but that might end up drawing attention away from the Jeep or cause panic that let them flee on foot. Perhaps he should let them regroup, come closer, then strike them with the timed blasts. Bullets whizzed overhead, someone firing blind into the treeline. Jake inhaled sharply, focusing on immediate survival. He leaned out from the Jeep and sighted his rifle at the pirate firing. 2 quick shots put him down. Another pirate dove behind the forklift, shouting frantically into a radio, "We're under attack! In the clearing! Someone's here!" Jake cursed. This would notify the main group by the cove, or even the captain himself. He had only seconds before reinforcements flooded the area. The forklift driver was reorienting, and Jake spotted a sidearm in the man's hand. He fired a controlled burst, forcing the driver to take cover behind the large tires. No time to linger. He retreated around the Jeep, scanning for a quick exit path. The chaos from the flashbang had given him a slight edge, but the pirates were rallying fast. Already he heard more shouting from deeper in the clearing, footsteps pounding as men converged. The tent rustled. Someone inside it was scrambling for a weapon. Jake sprinted toward the pines, weaving between stacked crates. An outstretched hand from behind the tent tried to grab him. He spun, slamming the butt of his M4 into the pirate's jaw. The man dropped, dazed. Jake kept moving, heart in his throat. Bullets tore through the tarp overhead, letting in bright shards of daylight. He dove behind a fallen tree near the clearing's edge, pausing just long enough to catch his breath. He looked back. The forklift was partially blocking the second truck. Men were shouting in at least 2 languages, and muzzle flashes flickered as they fired sporadic bursts into the woods, trying to pin him down. Jake had to make his move now. Reinforcements from the beach were surely on their way. He flicked the remote in his hand, toggling the channel for the truck charges. With one last glance at the clearing, he pressed the button. A thunderous boom rolled across the trees, followed by another, slightly offset. The blasts lit up the undercarriages of both trucks, sending fragments of metal and thick plumes of black smoke into the air. The forklift rocked from the shockwave, and the men near it were thrown to the ground. One truck's windshield shattered outward in a spray of glass. Flames gushed from under the hood, igniting the grass in a small circle. Men screamed and dove for cover. Jake felt the pressure wave rattle his teeth. He forced himself to breathe, scanning for any immediate threat to his position. The men who were still mobile scrambled, some shouting for water or extinguishers to save the cargo. Total chaos. Perfect. He clutched his rifle, muscles quivering from the surge of adrenaline, and began a careful retreat into the forest. Another staccato round of gunfire crackled behind him, chewing through branches and pine needles. But it was panicked, undisciplined fire. Jake kept low, zigzagging between trunks. Within seconds, he vanished into the thick green gloom. Once he was sure he wasn't being actively pursued, he slowed to a brisk walk, letting the forest swallow his footsteps. The tang of gunpowder lingered in the air, though it mixed with the pungent sap and brine typical of the coastal pines. He checked himself for injuries, nothing beyond a few scrapes and minor bruises. He'd done it. The trucks were wrecked. Even if they tried to salvage parts, it would take time they didn't have. That left them with only the Jeep, which, thanks to the charge he'd planted, was also compromised. If they tried to use it, he could detonate it whenever he chose. Now the pirates were pinned between the beach and the farmland, their ability to transport cargo severely limited. But that also meant they'd be more desperate, more dangerous. The men at the clearing, if they survived, would likely call the main group for backup. They'd come hunting for him, or they'd rush to the cove to regroup. The captain might decide to consolidate all forces for a single push inland, or he might press the fallback plan. Jake had to prepare. His thoughts turned to his farm and the possible incursion. He needed to make sure the boundaries were secure, check on the bound scouts, and finalize his defenses. Because once the pirates pieced together what happened, they would realize the local farm wasn't just some sleepy homestead. They'd learn it was owned by the deadliest Delta Force operator they'd never expected to face. And if they decided to come knocking on his doorstep, Jake Riker would be waiting. Part 5. Back at the coastline, the pirates' primary landing site seethed with tension and activity. A briny wind swept over the rocky beach, carrying shouts and the occasional crackle of radio chatter. The captain, the man with the black bandana, stalked among the crates with barely restrained rage etched into his sharp features. He just received a garbled report of explosions in the forest clearing. The trucks he had arranged were apparently destroyed. Impossible, he snarled at his lieutenant, the scar-faced man who stood by with arms folded. How could one or two local yokels manage this? The scar-faced lieutenant shrugged, though his eyes burned with concern. The men said they were under attack. They mentioned flash grenades, possibly someone with military training. The captain slammed a fist against a crate. The dull thud echoed across the beach. Nearby pirates exchanged anxious glances. Some had begun assembling in loose formations, uncertain whether they should be guarding the shoreline or preparing to move inland. Their plan for a smooth offload, discreetly stashing the explosives and contraband, had been shattered by the destruction of their trucks. Now confusion and fear rippled through their ranks. "Find out who is doing this?" the captain barked, glancing toward the anchored ship. "We can't stay here, pinned on this beach." Has the radio operator managed to raise the scouts? The scar-faced lieutenant frowned. "Negative. They're not responding. We suspect they're compromised. One of the men thinks he heard gunfire near the farm." "A farm?" the captain spat. "We chose this cove for privacy, to avoid exactly this." He stabbed a finger at the men nearby. "You two take a boat upriver, find a vantage point on that farmland. I want eyes on it immediately. The rest of you be ready for a fight. If someone is targeting us, we'll force them to reveal themselves." As the pirates rushed to comply, the captain swung around to the scar-faced lieutenant again. "If we can't move the cargo inland, we have to consider alternative plans. How many crates have we offloaded?" The lieutenant's brow furrowed. "Most of them, but we still have a few on the boat. The forklift is essential for the heavier ones, but if the clearing is compromised..." The captain waved him off. "We'll figure something out. Secure what's already ashore. Use the smaller vehicles if any are left intact. Send men to salvage the situation. And if they spot this attacker, his lips curled into a vicious grin, kill him, no mercy. With that, he strode off, black bandana snapping in the salty breeze. His men exchanged uneasy glances. This operation was supposed to be simple. Land quietly, hide the ordnance, and rendezvous with the buyer. Now confusion reigned. They hadn't come prepared for a full-scale engagement. Each passing minute made them more vulnerable to the unknown threat lurking somewhere inland. At his farm, Jake crouched in the tall grass near the barn. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon, bathing the fields in a golden glow. Despite the scenic backdrop, tension crackled in the air like the approach of a distant storm. Bandit stood next to him, muzzle lifted, alert. Through a gap in the barn boards, Jake could see the two unconscious pirates still bound behind a stack of pallets. They'd begun to stir, moaning softly. He'd have to deal with them soon. Either move them somewhere more secure or interrogate them for intel. The risk of them regaining full consciousness and making noise was significant. He slipped into the barn, signaling Bandit to follow. The dog padded in silently, nails clicking on the floorboards. Jake knelt by the unconscious men, checking their bindings. One pirate's eyes fluttered open, disoriented. When he saw Jake's face, he growled something in a foreign language. Jake frowned, pressing a canteen of water to the pirate's lips. The man resisted at first, then slurped greedily. "Talk," Jake said in a low voice. "How many are coming? What's your captain's plan?" The pirate spat water, glaring defiantly. "Go to hell," he hissed. "We'll kill you and burn this place." Jake remained impassive, though a spark of anger flared inside him. He set the canteen aside. "You'll get yourself killed if you keep ignoring reality. Your trucks are gone. Your scouts are down. You're running out of options." The pirate's face flickered with surprise for a split second, then hardened again. "You can't stop us all. Our captain has a ship, more men, guns. We have shipments you can't imagine." Jake sighed. This would be fruitless. The man was too indoctrinated or too terrified of his superiors to give up real intel. He secured the gag and checked the other captive, still out cold. The only real question was whether to leave them here or move them into the hidden cellar. For now, the barn would suffice, especially since he wanted to keep watch on them without revealing all his secrets. Standing, he patted Bandit's head. "We need to get ready," he murmured, feeling the dog's warm fur under his palm. He crossed the barn to a locked cabinet and took out a shortwave radio, an old piece of kit but reliable for direct transmissions. If the local sheriff was on any frequency, he might attempt a coded message to warn them of impending danger. But that presented risks too. If the pirates intercepted the broadcast, they could trace or jam it. He turned the radio on to a seldom-used channel. Static crackled. "Anyone listening on channel 7? Over," he said, keeping his voice low. He repeated this a few times, waiting, scanning for a reply. Nothing but static. Part of him knew it was unlikely he'd reach anyone with real resources. The small-town law enforcement might not even have their radio on at this hour, and if they did, they'd be ill-equipped to handle a paramilitary incursion. Even so, he had to try. He set the radio aside and considered his next move. The pirates would likely arrive in force, attempting to locate or neutralize him. If he waited passively, he risked being encircled or overwhelmed. Striking preemptively could keep them off balance. But where and how? His gaze drifted toward the eastern fields that sloped down to another stretch of rocky shoreline. He knew those fields intimately. Every ditch, every patch of wild brambles, every fence post. If the pirates tried a direct assault from that direction, he could ambush them. Conversely, they might come from the west or even attempt to flank him from the roads behind the farm. He recalled the improvised mortars and rocket launchers he'd glimpsed in some of the pirates' crates. If they decided to shell the farm from a distance, it could turn catastrophic. They might not hesitate to destroy everything if they deemed it necessary. That grim thought tightened his jaw. He had to intercept them before they could unleash wholesale destruction. Jake's mind turned to the hidden weapons cache beneath the house. He had more than just small arms in there. Some heavier ordnance he'd appropriated from black markets in his past missions. Could he use that to set up a perimeter defense? He exhaled, remembering that farmland was no fortress. There were too many open angles, too many vulnerabilities. If the pirates were determined to attack in numbers, holding them off alone would be a monumental challenge, even for him. A more cunning approach was essential. Divide them, pick them apart, sow chaos. Suddenly, Bandit let out a low growl, ears pricking. Jake's pulse quickened. He moved to the barn door, peeking through a narrow slot. On the horizon, dust kicked up. A small boat had beached on the rocky shore some ways off, and two figures were disembarking. One had a pair of binoculars raised, scanning inland. The other checked what looked like a submachine gun, then pointed in the farm's direction. Jake cursed under his breath. Another scouting party, or perhaps a forward assault team. They were approaching from the water, probably planning to slip around the perimeter. He let the barn door close quietly and trotted to the house with Bandit in tow. Once inside, he sprinted to the hidden closet and tapped the code to open the secret staircase leading to the basement arsenal. Down in the softly lit space, he paused to take stock. He grabbed a pair of NVG's night vision goggles, anticipating that dusk would soon settle. Next, he retrieved a suppressed sniper rifle. It was an M110 semi-automatic design, good for medium to long-range engagement. He slung it over his shoulder and picked up a bandolier of magazines loaded with match-grade ammunition. For close quarters, he still had his M4, but a sniper vantage could be invaluable for taking out threats at a distance. He emerged from the basement and locked the door behind him. Bandit waited by the kitchen window, peering outside as if understanding the seriousness of the moment. Jake padded over, scanning the shoreline with his binoculars. The two figures had advanced inland, hugging the terrain to stay out of sight. They'd be crossing into his fields soon. Time was of the essence. He decided on a vantage point. An old hayloft in the farm's smaller, disused barn on the western edge of his property. From there, he might get a clean shot at anyone traversing the fields. Quietly, he slipped out the back door, heading in that direction. He reached the smaller barn just as the sun's disk dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and orange. The barn's door creaked softly, but he eased it open enough to slip inside. Dust motes danced in the fading light as he climbed a rickety ladder to the loft, finding a rectangular gap in the ancient boards, perfect for a rifle muzzle and a scope. Jake settled in, elbow braced on an old beam. He set up the M110, adjusting the scope for distance. Through the crosshairs, he scanned the gently rolling fields. The golden hour light had deepened into purple shadows, making it harder to spot movement. In the distance, he caught a faint flicker, perhaps a silhouette shifting among tall grass. He breathed slowly, letting the tension flow out of him. This was the calm focus he'd honed over years of training. A sniper's patience. He keyed a small earpiece connected to his radio frequency scanner, listening for any chatter. Mostly static. Then a faint voice. "We see the farm buildings. 2 barns. Could be movement in one." Over. Jake's jaw set. They were close enough to see him or at least suspect where he was. If they had a thermal scope, they might pinpoint him. Carefully, he pulled down his NVGs, though the last glimmers of sunlight still provided some visibility. He toggled the scope's night optics, the reticle glowing with faint clarity. Movement. He spotted a dark form slinking between fence posts about 250 yards away. The figure held a weapon at the ready, scanning the barn. Another form followed behind, slightly offset to the left, a standard bounding overwatch tactic. These men knew what they were doing. Jake exhaled, slowed his pulse. He centered his crosshairs on the trailing figure. If he waited until they got closer, the shot would be easier, but they might also detect him. He was confident in his ability to drop them from this distance. The question was whether to reveal his position now or let them get in closer and risk them discovering his vantage. He made his choice. Better to strike first. He squeezed the trigger gently. A muffled bark from the rifle, suppressed but not silent. Through the scope, he saw the trailing figure jerk backward, arms flailing. The body collapsed in the grass. The forward figure spun, dropping to a knee, muzzle sweeping. Jake adjusted his aim, leading slightly. Another gentle squeeze. A spurt of earth erupted near the pirate's feet. He'd shifted position just in time. A muzzle flash flared from the pirate's weapon, bullets whistling dangerously close to the loft. Jake let out a slow breath, recalibrated, and squeezed again. The second shot found its mark. The man crumpled behind a fence post. Silence fell over the field, broken only by the echo of the shots reverberating in the hush of twilight. Jake held still, scanning. Both targets were down. He couldn't tell if the second was dead or just wounded, but neither was returning fire. He flicked on the radio scanner, hearing frantic chatter. "They got Miguel and base. Shots from the barn 200 meters out. Some kind of sniper. We need backup." He grimaced, recentering his scope. More pirates would converge. But how many, and from which direction? The shock and confusion might buy him time, or it might trigger an aggressive push. That was the lethal dance of small unit tactics. Every advantage you gained forced your enemy to adapt. Night was falling fast now. The horizon glowed faintly, but the fields were swallowed by darkness. Jake toggled to the NVG's high gain setting, the terrain popping into green-hued clarity. He caught glimpses of movement near the fence line, perhaps the wounded pirate. Then a flicker of light from far off. Headlamps? Flashlights? He tightened his grip on the rifle, settling in for a long, tense vigil. If the pirates decided on a nighttime assault, they'd soon discover that he excelled at nighttime engagements. But each victory came with the risk of drawing more and more of them toward his position. In the midst of that tension, a single thought burned brightly. He would protect his farm at all costs. The ghosts of his old life had found him, but he would not break. He'd stare them down, bullet by bullet, until every last pirate understood the folly of invading Jake Riker's land. Part 6. Darkness wrapped the farmland in a quiet shroud, broken only by the distant sounds of the ocean and the rustle of wind through the crops. Jake remained in the loft of the smaller barn, watchful for any sign of further movement in the fields. The two pirates he'd shot lay motionless near the fence line. Through his night vision scope, he occasionally caught a faint twitch of a limb or a shift of a shadow, but no one else had dared approach to retrieve the bodies. He adjusted his headset, scanning the radio frequencies. Sporadic bursts of chatter suggested the pirates were reorganizing, trying to figure out how to handle the sniper threat. Some advocated waiting for reinforcements from the cove, while others demanded a swift assault on the barn. The tension in their voices was evident. They knew they were up against a formidable adversary. Jake allowed himself a brief thought of relief that the two unconscious scouts in the main barn were still out of commission. Had they been awake, they might have tried to break free or create a distraction. He silently thanked Bandit for standing guard back at the larger barn. If the dog sensed any intruders slipping in from another direction, Jake trusted he'd be alerted. He exhaled, scanning the horizon. Though the farmland was expansive, it was also dotted with copses of trees, rocky outcroppings, and old fences. There were countless ways the pirates could attempt to flank him under cover of darkness. But he had something they didn't: precise knowledge of the terrain. The farm was his domain, every inch etched in his memory. If they tried to slip around, he might be able to catch them. A crackle on the radio made him stiffen. "Captain, we have lost contact with the team that went ashore from the boat. They're not responding." A beat of silence. Then the captain's voice, cold as steel. They were to recon the farm. If they're down, that means our enemy is even more skilled than we thought. Pull in our men from the clearing. Leave only a small guard. We push on the farm from multiple angles. We flush him out. Jake's lips tightened. They were going all in. He flicked his earpiece off. Knowing their plan was one thing, but the exact timing and approach were uncertain. He needed to shift position. Staying in this loft would be suicide if they brought heavy firepower or tried to set the structure ablaze. He might take a few of them down from here, but eventually they'd corner him. He eased off the loft, climbing down the rickety ladder. His boots hit the barn floor with a soft thud, stirring up ancient dust. The smell of old hay and rotted wood filled his nostrils. He moved to the barn side door, peering out into the moonlit field. All was still. A faint coastal breeze swept across, bringing the distant clamor of the surf. Crouching low, he slipped out, scanning for silhouettes or glints of moonlight reflecting off metal. Satisfied no one was immediately present, he headed toward a rocky gully that snaked behind the barn. He could follow it to a vantage point near the main house, then decide whether to dig in or set up another ambush. As Jake advanced through the gully, the wind carried the faint hum of an engine. He paused, ears straining. The noise wasn't coming from the direction of the cove, nor from the farmland's winding dirt road. It sounded closer to the ocean cliffs. Could the pirates have sent a vehicle around the perimeter? He pressed himself against a boulder and listened intently. The engine noise grew louder, then tapered off, replaced by the distinct squawk of tires on gravel. Something was out there, creeping along the edges of his property. Possibly the Jeep he had sabotaged, though he wasn't sure how they would have driven it this far without detonating the charge, or if they'd discovered the device. Another possibility was that they'd commandeered a local's vehicle. His breath caught. Could an innocent bystander have wandered into the conflict? He considered the neighbor's property a few miles inland. They rarely ventured out after dark, but it wasn't impossible. Fear for their safety spurred him forward, carefully climbing the side of the gully. At the crest, he flattened himself on the ground and peered over the tall grass. In the moonlit distance, a pair of headlights glowed, half obscured by a small stand of trees. The vehicle paused, engine idling. Jake lifted his rifle scope, toggling the night vision setting. Through the green glow, he saw a Jeep-like silhouette, but it seemed too clean, too new for the pirates' ragtag operation. Its stance was more akin to a specialized off-road Jeep used by paramilitary or advanced security teams. The driver wore a helmet. The passenger, stepping out, carried a rifle. Jake's heart thumped. Could it be the authorities or private security? Approaching quietly in the dead of night suggested they might be friend or foe. He decided to watch a moment longer. One occupant raised a radio, speaking in hushed tones. He narrowed his eyes, searching for clues. The vehicle's lines looked too professional to be a random civilian car. Another figure stood by the passenger door, scanning with a rifle. Were they a small response team, or had the pirates reinforcements from a different faction? Jake weighed his options. He could remain hidden or engage. Then, with shocking swiftness, a line of figures materialized from the darkness. Pirates, approaching the Jeep from multiple angles in a classic ambush pattern. Jake counted at least 4, moving in coordinated bursts. The men in the Jeep were about to be overrun. No time to hesitate. He braced his M110, centering the crosshairs on the lead pirate creeping up on the Jeep's flank. He squeezed the trigger. The pirate went down instantly. The second pirate turned, confusion etched in his body language, only to drop when Jake fired another round. The Jeep's passenger whipped around, rifle muzzle flashing as they opened fire on the remaining pirates. The driver revved the engine, swerving to avoid incoming bullets. Jake lined up a shot on a pirate behind a boulder, taking him out with a clean hit. One more pirate remained, firing a rapid burst that pinged off the Jeep's hood. The passenger returned fire, dropping him in a swift exchange. Silence descended, punctured only by the Jeep's rumbling engine. Jake kept his rifle trained, scanning for survivors. None of the pirates moved. The men in the Jeep conferred, likely wondering who'd fired those sniper shots. Jake flicked his small LED flashlight in a quick Morse code burst, SOS, hoping to signal he was friendly. The flashlight beam found him. The passenger shouted, "Identify yourself." Jake slowly rose, rifle slung across his chest, one hand raised. "My name's Jake," he called. "I've been fighting these pirates. You friendlies or more of them?" A tense pause, then the passenger lowered the rifle slightly. "Name's Ruiz," he said. "I'm private security. We got intel on a pirate incursion. Didn't expect a local to be laying down sniper fire." Jake let out a breath of relief. "Didn't expect any help. I've been handling them alone so far." "You alone?" Ruiz nodded at the driver, a woman named Cortez. She wore tactical gear and had a sidearm holstered at her hip. "We're a small team, contracted by a shipping company that lost cargo to these pirates. We're here to stop them, quietly if possible." Jake surveyed the fallen pirates, then looked at the Jeep's bullet-riddled frame. "Looks like your quiet approach ended already. You two all right?" Cortez shut the hood, which had popped slightly from the impacts. "Engine's not great, but we'll manage. We heard multiple reports of heavy equipment and explosives going inland. Figured we'd intercept. Then we ran into these guys." Jake nodded grimly. "They've got a large operation with a base at a hidden cove. I sabotaged most of their vehicles, so they're stuck. But they won't go down without a fight." Ruiz frowned. "We should coordinate. We have a small patrol boat as backup. 2 more of our team are scanning the coastline, but they're pinned down by the main pirate ship's watchers. We can't wait for them to mount a large rescue. The pirates might move sooner." Jake gestured toward his farm. "I have defenses there, hidden weapons, vantage points. Come with me. We'll fortify before the pirates regroup." This is far from over. Though tense, both mercenaries agreed. "We're in," Cortez said. "Just don't shoot us by accident." Jake allowed a wry smile. "Deal. Let's get moving." They piled into the Jeep, engine growling. Jake guided them back across his property, navigating by moonlight with the headlights off to maintain stealth. Along the way, they shared intel where the pirates were positioned, the scale of their arsenal, and likely infiltration routes. In the back seat, Bandit sniffed Cortez's hand warily before settling down. The dog seemed to sense an alliance forming, however tenuous. Jake felt the heavy weight of responsibility. He'd begun this fight alone, but now he wasn't the only one risking life and limb to stop the pirates. He had to make sure no one else paid the ultimate price for defending his home. Part 7. Jake guided Ruiz and Cortez through the winding dirt lanes that led back to the main farm buildings, the Jeep's engine growling softly as it negotiated ruts and dips. They moved without headlights, navigating by moonlight and memory. Bandit trotted alongside at first, then hopped into the rear seat when invited, tail wagging with hesitant enthusiasm at the newcomers. The dog seemed to sense they were allies for now. As they neared the farmhouse, shadows stretched across the yard, cast by the tall shape of the main barn and a scattering of old oak trees. The sky had deepened into a star-flecked canopy, night's hush broken only by the quiet rumble of the Jeep and the distant crash of surf. Yet an electric tension underpinned the stillness, like the lull before a violent storm. Jake pointed out an area near the barn where they could park. "We'll tuck the Jeep behind that stack of hay bales," he whispered. "It'll keep it partially concealed if pirates come sniffing around with spotlights or thermal." Cortez nodded, deftly maneuvering the vehicle into the narrow space. They all disembarked, rifles at the ready. Bandit hopped down, sniffing the ground before returning to Jake's side. They headed toward the farmhouse's side entrance, a heavy wooden door with reinforced hinges. Jake unlocked it swiftly, ushering them inside. Ruiz glanced around the interior, simple furniture, worn rugs, and a few personal touches that gave it a cozy, lived-in feeling. It was a stark contrast to the arsenal hidden below. Jake wasted no time. "Down here," he said, leading them to the secret closet. He punched in the code, revealing the stairway. Both mercenaries exchanged impressed looks as they stepped into the hidden basement. Cortez whistled softly, eyeing the racks of weapons and equipment. "You're better stocked than most small armies," she remarked, her voice laced with respect. Jake shrugged, already moving to retrieve gear. "Had a long career with special operations. Brought home a few souvenirs. Never thought I'd need to use them like this." He handed each of them a short-range encrypted radio. "We'll operate on Channel 8. Range might be limited, but it'll help coordinate if we split up." Ruiz tested the radio, nodding. "Any landline or satellite communication? We've got a battered sat phone in the Jeep, but it's iffy in this terrain." Jake grimaced. "Closest thing I have is an old satellite uplink, but it's not guaranteed. Besides, I doubt we have time for a full cavalry to arrive. This is probably on us." Cortez checked a crate filled with spare magazines and grenades, selecting a few for her loadout. "So what's the plan? The pirates will be mobilizing soon. They have numbers, and they'll be desperate to salvage their operation. Our best bet might be to hold them at bay until daybreak, then pick them off with superior positioning." Jake considered that. "We can set up ambush points around the property. I know every ditch, every blind corner. But we have to coordinate effectively or they'll slip past us. Plus, they might come from multiple directions, land, sea, or even flank us from the roads. We can't be everywhere at once." Ruiz slung a bandolier of shotgun shells over his shoulder, though he carried an assault rifle. "We can create choke points, force them down certain paths with well-placed barricades or traps. If we make them think we're concentrated in one area, we can funnel them into kill zones." Jake nodded. "Exactly. I've got barbed wire, spare lumber, even some old tractor implements we can use as obstacles. Let's pick strategic spots, like near that rocky outcrop behind the barn, or the narrow gap between the greenhouse and the animal pens." They huddled around a tattered old map of the farm pinned to the basement wall. Using a grease pencil, Jake marked potential choke points and vantage spots. Ruiz and Cortez contributed their own tactical expertise. Despite having just met, they found an easy rapport, the shared language of small unit strategies bridging any gaps. Finally, they had a plan. They would fortify 3 main lines of defense, one near the main barn and farmhouse, one along the eastern fields, and one along the treeline adjacent to the orchard. The hope was that by creating partial barricades and funneling the pirates, they could force them into positions where Jake and the mercenaries had the advantage of cover and elevated sightlines. Jake pressed a final detail. "We also have to watch out for any attempts to shell us from afar. They have explosives. They might try to blast the house or the barn if they get a chance." Cortez tapped the crate of gear with her boot. "You got any anti-armor measures or heavier ordnance?" Jake gave a humorless chuckle. "I do have something that might work, an RPG launcher from an old stash with a couple of rounds. We used it for stopping vehicles overseas, but it can deter ground advances as well." He walked over to a locked cabinet and pulled out a battered tube, a relic from a conflict half a world away. "We can station this at the second line. If they come rolling in with something bigger, we'll give them a nasty surprise." Ruiz grabbed a handful of claymore mines. "These will help with the choke points. We just have to be careful not to trap ourselves." Jake nodded. "Agreed. Let's get moving. We'll set the perimeter before they arrive in force." They ascended the stairs, moving quietly through the farmhouse. Outside, the night air was cooler, and a thin mist had begun to settle over the fields. Stars glimmered overhead, and the moon shone just enough light to silhouette the terrain. Perfect conditions for a stealthy defense. Working with hushed efficiency, they hauled supplies, barbed wire rolls, wooden planks, metal spikes, into key positions. At the rocky outcrop near the barn, they rigged a makeshift barricade, weaving wire and debris to slow any direct approach. In the orchard, they placed claymores at intervals behind tree trunks, angled to catch anyone advancing through the rows of fruit trees. Jake and Cortez teamed up to position old farm equipment, rusted plows, harrows, a broken-down tractor, across certain choke points, forcing would-be attackers to navigate a narrow passage that could be easily covered by gunfire. Meanwhile, Ruiz took the RPG launcher to a spot near the greenhouse, where he had a decent vantage of the entire eastern field. They agreed on a simple fallback system. If the outer lines were breached, they'd regroup at the barn, then the farmhouse. It was laborious, sweaty work, but they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that time was short. Throughout the night, Jake's mind flickered with memories of past missions, building hasty defenses in hostile territory, praying that the meager barriers and booby traps would give them the edge they needed. But never had it felt so personal. This was his home, his land, where every hoofprint and every stone carried memories of a peaceful life he'd fought to create. Sometime close to midnight, they paused in the barn, checking gear and sipping water. Bandit lay curled near Jake's feet, eyes half shut but ears perked for danger. The two unconscious pirates remained bound in the corner, one glaring silently now that he was awake. Jake had tightened their restraints, taking no chances. Ruiz exhaled, leaning against a wooden beam. "We've done what we can. Now it's a waiting game." Jake scanned the gloom beyond the barn door. "They'll come. I can feel it. The question is how soon and how many." Cortez reloaded her rifle with smooth precision. "We've each faced worse odds, right?" she said, attempting a tight smile. "But these guys are well-armed and determined. The captain won't back down lightly." Jake felt a dull weight in his chest. "I know." He glanced at Bandit, then at his farmhouse. "No matter what happens, I appreciate your help." Ruiz nodded, clapping Jake on the shoulder. "We're in this together now. Let's make sure they regret ever setting foot on your land." The hours crept by with agonizing slowness. They settled into defensive positions, scanning the night through rifle scopes and NVGs. The air was still, thick with a sense of foreboding. Occasionally, a distant rustle or the cry of a nocturnal animal would jangle their nerves, only for them to realize it was a false alarm. The quiet before the storm was almost worse than a direct assault. Shortly after 2 a.m., a faint droning hum carried on the wind from the east. Jake tensed, pressing his ear against the air. Engines, several of them, possibly trucks or SUVs the pirates had commandeered elsewhere, or maybe they'd repaired the Jeep. He keyed his radio. "Contact, east side. Stand by." From his vantage near the greenhouse, Ruiz responded quietly, "I see headlights, multiple. Might be 2 or 3 vehicles. They're moving slowly." Jake shifted his position at the orchard's edge, sighting through his scope. Sure enough, halos of light glowed in the distance, bobbing along the uneven rural road that skirted his property. He counted 3 sets of headlights, creeping forward as if searching for an approach. A burst of radio chatter crackled. "They're turning off the road now, cutting across the fields. I can't get a clear shot yet." That was Ruiz. Jake breathed evenly. "Wait until they commit," he whispered into his mic. "We'll spring the trap once they're inside the orchard or the wire." He glanced over at Cortez, who was positioned behind a row of overturned crates near the barn. She gave him a nod, confirming she was ready. The orchard was the likely first point of contact, thanks to the claymores and partial barricade. If the pirates tried to drive through, they'd be in for a lethal surprise. The headlights bobbed closer, weaving around rocks and uneven ground. Jake could just make out the shapes of the vehicles. 2 pickups, their beds loaded with men, and an SUV trailing behind. The pirates must have scrounged them up from some local yard. They seemed to be searching for an easy route to the farm, guided by the knowledge that the main roads were too obvious and possibly obstructed. As the first pickup neared the orchard perimeter, Jake held his breath. The lead driver slowed, shining a spotlight on the rows of trees, evidently suspicious. A shadowy figure in the truck bed swept a rifle-mounted flashlight across the orchard's interior. The beam skittered over branches and leaves, briefly illuminating one of the claymore signs Jake had posted. The figure shouted a warning. Jake cursed under his breath. They might spot the mines. For half a second, he debated detonating them now, but the pirates were still at a slight distance. Instead, he pivoted his scope to a vantage on the nearest truck, searching for the driver's silhouette. If he could take out the driver, the vehicle might lurch or stall, triggering confusion. He lined up the shot, exhaled, squeezed. The glass of the driver's side window exploded, and a figure slumped over the wheel. The truck's engine revved wildly as the driver's dead weight pressed the accelerator. The vehicle lurched forward into the orchard, straight into the claymore zone. Boom! A deafening blast tore through the night, followed by a shower of splintered wood and earth. Screams ripped the air. Pieces of metal and truck debris flew in all directions, lit by the flash of the explosion. The orchard leaves glimmered with the brief wash of firelight. Jake immediately worked his bolt, searching for new targets. The second pickup veered violently, the men in the bed shouting in panic. Some tried to jump off. Another claymore detonated, triggered by their proximity. The blast tore into the group, leaving the pickup with shredded tires and a crater in the ground. Gunfire erupted from the SUV. Muzzle flashes strobed in the dark, bullets zipping through the orchard. Jake ducked behind a tree trunk, hearing them thwack into wood. He keyed his mic. "Cortez, watch that SUV." From her position, Cortez launched a volley of suppressive fire with her assault rifle. Tracers streaked across the orchard, slamming into the SUV's hood. Smoke hissed from beneath the engine block. The driver leaned on the horn, then tried to reverse, but the battered vehicle stalled, pinned between churned earth and rows of fruit trees. Ruiz joined in, firing the RPG. The rocket screamed across the field, missing the SUV by a few feet and detonating behind it in a geyser of dirt. The concussion wave rocked the vehicle, flipping it partially onto its side. Pirates tumbled out, scrambling for cover, only to be met by a hail of bullets from multiple angles. Jake shifted position, searching for any sign of the pirate captain. Amid the chaos, flames flickering from the wrecked trucks, muzzle flashes lighting up the orchard. He spotted a tall figure wearing a black bandana, rallying survivors behind a smoldering pickup. The man's voice carried, distinct and furious, though Jake couldn't make out the words. He lined up the shot, but the captain darted behind the engine block just as Jake squeezed the trigger. The bullet ricocheted off metal, sparking into the night. Cursing softly, Jake repositioned, but the orchard was awash in confusion. Wounded men crawling, vehicles on fire, muzzle flashes strobing. The acrid smell of burning rubber and gunpowder choked the air. In the swirling shadows, the captain and a handful of pirates managed to regroup. They lobbed grenades toward Jake's orchard lines, forcing him to dive behind a trunk as shrapnel peppered the leaves. Another explosion rocked the orchard, toppling a couple of small trees. Flames danced everywhere, turning the calm farmland into a blazing war zone. Jake's radio crackled. "They're pushing to the barn." That was Cortez. "I see at least 5, including the captain." Jake clenched his jaw, realizing the orchard defense had done its damage, but the pirates' leadership was still alive and advancing. "Fall back to the barn if you have to," he told her. "We'll tighten the perimeter there." He fired one more burst at the moving shadows, catching a pirate in the thigh. The man collapsed with a shriek. Then Jake sprinted from tree to tree, using the orchard as cover, heading toward the barn. Adrenaline surged, the deafening roar of flames and gunfire fueling each stride. The orchard was partially ablaze, and the night sky pulsed with flickers of orange light. Bullets whistled overhead. He glimpsed bandits scurrying out of the orchard, tail low, to safety behind some crates. Cortez and Ruiz converged at the barn's entrance, exchanging gunfire with pirates who tried to flank from the eastern field. Jake reached them, chest heaving. "We hold this line. If they break through, we retreat inside the barn. We've rigged wire and traps there." Cortez nodded, sweat streaming down her face. "They're hitting us hard, Jake." "They're desperate," he replied, reloading his rifle. "We take down the captain, the rest might crumble. That's our priority." As if on cue, the captain's voice sliced through the night from somewhere beyond the orchard's burning edge. "You can't hide forever, farmer. I'll skin you alive for what you've done." The words dripped with venom, amplified by raw fury. Jake gritted his teeth, bracing behind a half-collapsed fence. "I'm right here," he muttered, scanning for a target through the swirling smoke. This was it. The final confrontation was unfolding, each second pulling them closer to a decisive clash. And if he failed, his beloved farm would be the pirate's trophy. That was something Jake Riker refused to allow. Part 8. Conclusion. Sparks arced through the smoky night air as Jake, Cortez, and Ruiz took cover near the barn. Their weapons braced against the battered fence. The orchard behind them glowed with the flames of the destroyed vehicles and the remnants of claymore explosions. Flickers of orange and red illuminated the dark silhouettes of pirates, weaving through the thick smoke, desperate to push forward. "Watch the left side," Cortez hissed, spotting a pair of men attempting to circle wide around the barn. She leaned out and fired short, controlled bursts. One pirate dropped, the other dove behind a smoldering tree stump. Ruiz followed up with suppressive shots, forcing the man to retreat. Jake's eyes swept the chaos, searching for the black bandana that marked the captain. He knew that if they didn't cut off the head of this serpent soon, more pirates might rally, or the captain might unleash one last desperate gambit with the explosives. The notion sent a chill through Jake's spine. He clenched his jaw, determined not to let that happen. Another flurry of gunfire erupted from the orchard edge. Muzzle flashes lit the swirling smoke. Jake returned fire, his shots guided by muscle memory. He scored a hit on a pirate who'd been leveling a grenade launcher, another immediate threat neutralized. The man collapsed, launcher clattering uselessly to the grass. "Cover me," Jake shouted, pressing forward a few yards. Cortez and Ruiz fired in tandem, peppering the orchard line to keep the pirates pinned. Jake sprinted behind a low stone wall that ran along the barn's perimeter. From there, he had a better angle, letting him see past the orchard into the open field. In the distance, shapes moved, reinforcements or stragglers. He toggled his radio. "Ruiz, check that eastern approach. Are we about to be flanked?" A second passed, then Ruiz's voice crackled back. "I see movement, 2 or 3 silhouettes. Could be more. They're trying to come in behind us." Jake cursed softly. "We can't let them pin us from both sides. Try to hold them off." "I'm going for the captain." Ruiz sounded grim. "Roger that. Don't get yourself killed, man." Jake raised his head, scanning the orchard for that black bandana. Finally, he caught a glimpse. A tall figure crouched by a shattered pickup, shouting orders at the remaining pirates. The man's voice was hoarse with rage, but his commands still had authority. 2 pirates darted out, lobbing grenades at the barn. The explosions shook the ground, showering Jake's position with splinters of wood and dirt. Time to finish this. Jake sprinted low across the yard, weaving among debris. Bullets snapped past, one grazing his sleeve. Pain flared as a line of heat scorched his upper arm. He bit back a grunt, adrenaline surging. He slid behind the half-burned husk of an old tractor, panting, heart pounding in his ears. Peering around the tractor's wheel, he saw the captain just 20 yards ahead, partially shielded by the pickup's mangled chassis. The man barked something into a handheld radio, glancing at the orchard, then at the barn. Jake steadied his rifle, aiming center mass. Before he could fire, a pirate on the captain's flank spotted him and opened fire. Bullets pinged off the tractor, forcing Jake to duck. "I've got you pinned now," a rough voice snarled, stepping closer. The muzzle of an assault rifle loomed. Jake dropped flat, letting the pirate's aim pass overhead, then kicked out hard, slamming his boot into the pirate's knee. The man howled, toppling forward. Jake fired a single round from his pistol at point-blank range, ending the threat. But the shot also gave away his position. The captain wheeled, leveling an AK-style rifle. Jake threw himself behind the tractor as a barrage of bullets ricocheted, sparks dancing off metal. "You think you can stop me?" the captain roared, voice laced with fury. "I've taken bigger prizes than this worthless farm." Jake's chest tightened. He shouted back, "Then why are you losing so many men, Captain? Why are your vehicles burning in my orchard?" The feral snarl answered, "You're dead, farmer. I'll bury you here and take what I want." From the right flank, more gunfire erupted Cortez's rifle. She had circled behind a low stack of crates, and now her shots peppered the pickup, forcing the captain to shift. The captain cursed, returning fire. Jake seized the opening, lunging up to unload a burst from his M4. One shot clipped the captain's shoulder, spinning him around. The black bandana whipped as the captain staggered, leaning against the ruined pickup. Rage contorted his features. With a bloodied hand, he yanked out a pistol and aimed at Jake. Jake squeezed his trigger again, but his magazine ran dry. Click. Desperation flared. He dove sideways, the captain's bullet grazing his leg. Pain ignited. Cortez fired another volley, striking the captain in the side. He grunted, dropping to one knee. Jake fumbled to reload, blinking sweat from his eyes. The swirling smoke and flames made the scene surreal, as if the farmland had become a vision of some war-torn land. "Riker!" the captain spat, coughing up blood. "I've seen devils like you before, but they always fall." Jake slammed a fresh magazine into his rifle. "Not this time." He steadied the weapon, his wounded leg protesting each movement. He fired a triple tap, center mass. The captain's chest jerked with each impact, his body collapsing against the pickup's twisted frame. The black bandana slipped from his forehead, drifting to the ground. For a moment, he tried to raise his pistol, but the strength bled from his limbs. With a final, rattling breath, the pirate captain slumped, eyes vacant. Jake's arms trembled, adrenaline coursing. He heard more gunshots from the barn, but they sounded scattered, less organized. Without their captain, the pirates were losing cohesion. A few more bursts, and the orchard fell ominously quiet except for crackling flames. "Jake!" Cortez called, emerging from behind the crates. Smoke smudged her face, and sweat streaked her hairline. "You all right?" He nodded, wincing at the stinging pain in his arm and leg. "I'll live." He limped over to the captain's corpse, nudging the pistol away with his boot. The radio lay nearby, spitting broken static. Jake pressed the transmit button. "Your captain is dead," he said, voice harsh. "Throw down your weapons, or we'll finish you off." At first, there was no response, just the crackle of static. Then a trembling voice. We surrender. Don't shoot. We have wounded." Jake glanced at Cortez, who nodded. Over the next 10 minutes, the pirates who were still mobile began emerging from the orchard, weapons discarded. Some tried to crawl away unnoticed, but Ruiz caught them. By the time the fires died down, they had half a dozen prisoners battered and demoralized. The rest were dead or grievously wounded. The pitched battle was over. Dawn crept over the horizon, bathing the farm in a pale, golden light that revealed the extent of the damage. The orchard was scarred by blackened craters and singed trees. Shredded vehicle remains littered the yard. The barn and farmhouse bore bullet holes, shattered windows, and splintered beams. Smoke still curled from some smoldering wreckage. Jake, Ruiz, and Cortez stood by the main barn, surveying the aftermath. Bandits sniffed around the rubble, occasionally whining at the acrid smell of burnt rubber and gunpowder. Jake's leg was bandaged, courtesy of Cortez's field kit. His arm stung from a graze, but he counted himself lucky to be alive. Ruiz exhaled, shaking his head. "This place looks like a war zone." Cortez nodded solemnly. "But we did it. The pirates are done. We'll call in the authorities now. Maybe the Coast Guard, or whoever we can trust to take these prisoners into custody." Jake ran a hand over his stubbled jaw. "I'll call the sheriff as well. He might not be equipped to handle all this, but he can coordinate with bigger agencies. Once they see the scale of the operation, they'll bring in the feds or the Navy. We've got enough evidence here to bury these guys in charges." He looked around at the place he called home. The destruction weighed on him, but so did a grim sense of pride. He had protected his farm. The cost had been high, but he was alive, and so were his unlikely allies. The coastal community, unaware of just how close it had come to devastation, would wake up to the news of a thwarted pirate invasion. The farmland might bear scars, but it had withstood the storm. Cortez watched him. "What's next for you, Jake?" He gazed at the rising sun, the sky tinted with pink and lavender. "I'll rebuild, clean up this mess, maybe find some peace again." He glanced at the barn's bullet-riddled exterior. "I was a soldier for so long. I retired to get away from it all. But it seems you can't always escape your past." Ruiz clapped him gently on the shoulder. "Sometimes, the world needs people like you. Quiet professionals, ready to defend when no one else can." Jake offered a small nod. He thought of the unconscious pirates still bound inside, the cove with the anchored ship, and the contraband that law enforcement would soon seize. This entire coastline had nearly become a staging ground for terror. Instead, it would stand as a testament to one man's resolve, and the help of a few allies who'd shown up in the nick of time. Already, the early morning breeze carried fresh scents, salt air from the ocean, a faint hint of dew on the grass. Life would go on. He felt the first stirrings of relief, mixed with sorrow for the dead and gratitude for having survived. There would be questions, investigations, endless paperwork. But for now, in this quiet dawn, he allowed himself a moment of calm. His farmland was battered but free. The pirates had learned the ultimate lesson. Never underestimate the unassuming farmer, especially when he's the deadliest commando alive. And as the sun rose, painting the sky in brilliant gold, Jake Riker stepped forward to begin the long road of healing and rebuilding on the land he cherished more fiercely than ever.